Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me today to learn about IEPs and IFSPs for the Down Syndrome Diagnosis Network webinar series. My name is Jessica Kuss. I'm the Director of Community Programs at the National Down Syndrome Society. I have been with NDSS for just about 9 years and am the proud mom to a 12-year-old son with Down syndrome and was previously a special education teacher for 7 years before becoming a mom. And so I have a background in the classroom and as a parent being on the other side of the table in both IEP and IFSP meetings. At NDSS, our mission is simple and powerful. We're creating a world where individuals with Down syndrome thrive. Everything we do is rooted in supporting families like yours. NDSS focuses on 4 key pillars that support individuals with Down syndrome across the lifespan and their families: resources and support, research, advocacy and policy, and community engagement. The first pillar is resources and support. This includes our helpline, our information email, and resources that cover everything from birth through aging. We start out with our new and expectant parent guide and have resources all the way through end of life and caregiver support. The second pillar is research. We develop tools, expand access, and create opportunities for individuals with Down syndrome and their families to learn about and participate in the latest research and clinical trials that we share widely, so families are empowered with knowledge that drive advocacy and improve lives. Advocacy and public policy. We work at the federal, state, and local levels to protect and expand the rights of individuals with Down syndrome. We develop and improve laws to positively impact people with Down syndrome across the country and affirm their human rights. And our legislative agenda spans the life experience of individuals with Down syndrome and disability as a whole. Community engagement is our fourth pillar. This includes our programming like the National Buddy Walk, the Times Square video, scholarships, grants, and other national events that bring our community together, such as our gala, golf event, and our virtual Racing for 321 on World Down Syndrome Day event every March. Let's get into today's content. First, we're going to talk about Individualized Family Service Plans, or IFSPs. An Individualized Family Service Plan, or IFSP, is a written document that outlines the early intervention services that a child will receive when he or she is eligible for early childhood special education services. IFSPs are for children ages birth until 3, and all children receiving early intervention, or EI services, under IDEA Part C must have an IFSP, but specific guidelines for the IFSP vary from state to state. When you receive a diagnosis, whether it is at birth or prenatally, you can reach out to your local state office and request an evaluation for an IFSP or early intervention services. Having a diagnosis of Down syndrome should automatically qualify you for these services. When your child is evaluated for an IFSP, several areas will be assessed. These include physical and cognitive development, communication, social emotional development, adaptive skills, fine and gross motor skills, vision, hearing, and overall health. This will give a team a full picture of your child's strengths and needs and determine what areas of support or related services might be beneficial to them as they begin to develop and hit their milestones. An IFSP includes several key components: the people and organization involved in your child's current level of functioning, your family information, the services your child receives, goals, and the transition plan for when your child approaches age 3 and would age out of the IFSP or early intervention process. One of the most important things to remember is that the IFSP is family-centered. Your routines, your priorities, and your goals matter. So with an IFSP, they want to look at the day-to-day, what's going on in the home. So might look at things like feeding, play. How can you build in these therapies and activities into what you already do day to day to help reinforce these skills that perhaps your child might be delayed in? We might look at having a feeding therapist to work on, feeding themselves, and that might require occupational therapy or a speech and language pathologist. A physical therapist might be brought out if you are working on things like core strength with sitting, walking, crawling, navigating the home. All of those pieces are rooted in what it is that is going on in your day-to-day life. And the purpose of early intervention is really to enhance what goes on in the home and not give you a list of more things that you have to do in an already very busy and chaotic time when you're trying to juggle many appointments, perhaps other children, or just regular day-to-day life, work, and life in general. Individualized education plans, or IEPs, are plans or programs developed to ensure that a child who has a disability is identified under the law and is attending elementary or secondary school and receives specialized instruction and related services. So an IEP would go into effect once your child enters the school system, which is typically around age 3. These services are often provided in the public school setting or in a setting in which the public school system pushes in services, where with an IFSP, services are historically and typically provided in your home, where an occupational therapist, education consultant, a physical therapist, a speech pathologist would come into your home on a more maybe a monthly or bi-monthly basis to give you tips and advice on how to work in these skills within your home and your daily routine, whereas the IEP is you would be attending school on a more regular day-to-day basis or multiple days a week, and the services would be provided in a school setting and not in the home setting. The IEP includes several major components. First is the team, and the most important member of the team outside of the individual with Down syndrome, which is the focus, is you as a parent. Parents are required members of the IEP team, and you have the most expertise and you know your child best. The next part of the IEP would be parent input. This is your opportunity to share who your child is beyond data and assessments. The present levels of performance would describe where your child is right now. This section is sort of the foundation of the entire IEP, where your child's strengths are, maybe where areas of need are, maybe things that they're working on, where you might write, they've mastered their alphabet, but they are working on potty training, or, they're able to climb stairs, but not alternate their feet yet. So all of that is captured in more of a narrative form in the present levels page, which then drives the writing of goals and objectives. So goals and objectives should be meaningful, measurable, tailored to your child, and meet the needs in the gaps of where they are behind their typical peers. The IEP will also outline special education and related services, such as speech therapy, occupational therapy, or physical therapy. While under early intervention services, those related therapies would have been provided perhaps in the home, the school system would then take over and provide these services in a school setting if there is determined that there is a need to receive these types of services. You are also always able to supplement with private services through your own insurance provider if that is something that is available to you, but your child is entitled through an IEP to receive those related services through the school system as well. If your child is not currently receiving speech, occupational, or physical therapy, and you feel there is a need for them, you can always request for an evaluation for one of those related services. And I just always recommend that anytime that you are going to be requesting or asking for these, that you do so in writing, which can just be an email to the team lead or to the special education teacher or to the school principal to say, you would like to request a formal evaluation for speech and language services. And then the school will be required to provide that evaluation and determine if your child meets the requirements to qualify them for such related services. The IEP also outlines accommodations and modifications which help your child access learning. So accommodations are things like, you might need a different way to enter the building if you are maybe not walking yet. Say your child just turned 3 and they're maybe using a walker, or they're still in a stroller because they're not walking. An accommodation might be that they need access to a ramp to enter school, or they need specialized seating to support core strength if they're not sitting up on their own yet, or they need a back to a chair, or perhaps they're working on learning to write, and so they need a different type of pencil grip or things like that. Those are all accommodations in which support getting access to the curriculum that's at hand. Modifications are specific changes, typically to the curriculum. So not so much in preschool, but when you're entering into, K through 12 work, a modification might be to a test that has 15 questions. Maybe the test would only have 5 questions, or maybe in multiple choice questions would be, instead of 4 choices, there would be 2 choices. Those are modifications to the curriculum. Other modifications would be you're only teaching pieces of a certain subject or of a certain curriculum and not the entirety of the curriculum to meet the varying needs and abilities of each individualized student. So every child with Down syndrome, every child with an IEP is different. And so these accommodations and modifications are individualized to each student's needs. And there's a dedicated section of everyone's IEP where accommodations and modifications are spelled out explicitly. Every state, even within states, even school districts have different program and different formats for the IEP and how they look. But these key components of an IEP are included in all public school IEPs and should be. Placement and service delivery is how and where the services will be provided. Every child is entitled to a free and appropriate public education, which you might hear shortened to FAPE. And that means that they are educated in their least restrictive environment to the greatest extent possible, which would be attending their base school, which is your neighborhood school, where everybody in the neighborhood goes. Be in a classroom with typically developing peers, unless the nature or severity of their disability would be that they are unable to access curriculum in a general education setting. I will note that at age 3, when you're making that transition from early intervention into the public school system for preschool, it can be difficult to find preschools in a public school setting that are truly inclusive, and that is because there is not universal preschool in the United States. And so children with special education needs and qualify for an IEP are entitled to preschool services in the public school system. Typically, developing children who do not have additional needs through an IEP or through a Head Start program do not typically have access to free preschool programming. So placement and services sometimes differ because not every elementary school has a preschool program. So if your child is going to a public preschool in your school district, it might not be at your base school, but it would still be the least restrictive environment simply because not every base elementary school has a preschool because there are fewer students that are attending preschool. I also encourage you to work with your district and your IEP teams to find inclusive options if that is something that you feel is the least restrictive environment for your student, that there are alternative options and creative ways to receive preschool related services in inclusive settings, even if your district does not always provide them You might be able to work with other private preschools and work with your school team to promote a more inclusive opportunity if your school is not able to offer that based on how their preschool programming looks. But once you hit kindergarten, it should always be the aim that you are going to your least restrictive environment in your base school, which is that home school that your entire community, based on where you live, attends. And finally, it includes transition planning, which becomes especially important as your child gets older. The transition plan from an IFSP to an IEP is, that they're aging out of early intervention, which is typically right at age 3. So if you're going to turn 3 during the school year, you might start preschool with an IEP when you're, 2.5 or 2 3/4, simply because you'll turn 3 by the certain cutoff, whatever that is for your state or your district. But then transition planning becomes even more important when we're looking at what does life after high school looks like. So that's a whole other presentation that we won't get into. I'm sure that's years away for many of us. But that does become an integral part of the IEP, depending on where you live when your child is either 14 or 16. So some tips for parents with your IEP. IEP meetings can feel overwhelming, even for experienced and seasoned parents, even as someone like myself who was a special education teacher for many years. But that was before I wore the hat of also being a parent. So I just wanted to provide some maybe tips and advice that might help you feel a little bit more prepared and confident. One thing that I stress that everyone do, even if it's just a few sentences, is to provide a parent input statement before the meeting. This helps sets the tone and ensure that your voice is heard, even if it's just a simple, my son or daughter really loves watching this TV show, eating this snack, and doing X, Y, or Z for fun. Your vision or your goal for your child moving forward, whether it's short term in that school year, might be, to master writing their name, or you want to give a bigger vision statement or goal that your goal is for your child to graduate high school and go on to college. You can make it as big or as little as you would like, but there is a spot on every IEP for parent input. And so all you have to do is either bring it to the meeting, or you can even suggest that the team copy and paste if you email it to them and just request ahead of the meeting, hey, we want to make sure our voice and input is heard. So if you could copy and paste this into the parent input section of the IEP ahead of the meeting, we would appreciate it. And then that becomes a part of the record, that becomes a part of the IEP, and just helps humanize things a little bit. And when you're all sitting around a table, when you've got a principal, a special ed teacher, a gen ed teacher, parents, speech pathologists, that you're remaining centered on who you're talking about, and that it is a person and it is your child, and they are important and should be the center of all of the decisions and conversations at that table. Creating an all about me page. I think there's several templates out there. I think Rockin' Mom many years ago, probably maybe over 10 years ago now, created a template on Canva in which it offered some great guidance on including a picture of your child with Down syndrome, maybe some of their favorite things, what works well for them as far as, reinforcers, or maybe areas that, they struggle with a little bit, things that you notice they work well at home, that you want them to be able to do at school. And then you can print that out or share that on a screen. I have found that has been one of the highlights over the years of my IEP meetings with my own child, is passing out his All About Me page, which now at 12 and about to wrap up his elementary school career, he's able to really be an active part in creating that and sharing, what things he likes about school and what things are more difficult for him. And having that as part of the conversation as we kick off the meeting is really helpful. Preparing questions ahead of time. No question is too small. Some schools and some states require drafts of goals be sent home ahead of time. So if your state or school does do that, take the time to read through them and ask clarifying questions, bring them to the table. There's a lot of acronyms in the special education world, and so just professionally as a former teacher, I know I could rattle off saying FAPE, LRE, all of these acronyms, and parents don't always know what they mean. So please always come with questions, come prepared. No question is too small. You are just as much an active participant, if not the most important participant, since you know your child best in this meeting. So be sure that you understand everything that is being presented to you and that you ask the questions. If the school allots a certain time for a meeting, say, hey, we're meeting for 45 minutes, and you realize as that 45-minute block is ending that you're not anywhere near finished with your questions or getting through, it's perfectly acceptable to take a pause and say we need to schedule some more time to have a second meeting or to continue this meeting to make sure that all of your questions are answered, especially as we're entering into some of these first IEP meetings when you maybe haven't attended many before. There's a lot to talk about. It could be a new school, it could be a new teacher, it could be a new team. And you want to make sure that you have all the information you need to feel comfortable and confident that your child is going to be successful. Review your procedural safeguards. These are your rights as a parent. So the school should provide this to you either via email or hard copy, either at the meeting or ahead of the meeting, but you should be able to go to your state Department of Education and look at your parental procedural rights and safeguards. NDSS has an education map on our website, which I will share the link to all of our education resources coming up in the next slide. And you can click on your state and then click down to the procedural rights and safeguards that for your specific state on our map. It is a hefty document. They're often, anywhere from 20 to 80 pages long, but it offers a lot of information on your rights as a parent and answers questions that you might have related to policies or consent or evaluations, assessments, those types of things. So you can often get answers to some of those bigger questions by referencing the procedural safeguards. You can ask for assessments, evaluation data ahead of the meeting. If this is your initial meeting, you might not have a lot of those, but as time goes on, if you are looking to update annual goals, you have a right to see what they've used to assess and collect data to determine if they've met or not met the current goals, and if you want to determine to keep those goals for yet another year, or if you need to maybe reevaluate as to why wasn't this working, or do we need to reword something? Have we mastered part of a goal but not all of the goal? And then how are we going to frame that moving forward? And how are we going to monitor it? You can also ask throughout the year for updates. You should get quarterly progress notes, just like if you would get a report card, you should get a progress report related to IEP goals as well, along with a report card if your child has an IEP. And if you don't understand the results of these assessments or the data, ask for clarification. It's completely appropriate to ask for things in clear and plain language or to receive an explanation. If English is not your first language, you are entitled to an interpreter in IEP meetings or any meeting that you have with the school related to your child. So please make sure you communicate those needs if that's not being asked of you ahead of time. Just know that you have the ability to request that, and the school is required to provide you with an interpreter if you need it to understand what is being discussed about your child in these meetings. So NDSS has a variety of education-specific resources as well as our lifespan resources on our website. One thing that I did not note here, we also have a developmental milestone chart on our website as well that kind of lists the average milestone development for individuals with Down syndrome in that birth to 3 compared to typically developing peers. So maybe a typically developing baby might sit between, 3 and 6 months. A baby with Down syndrome, the average sitting age is maybe 6 to 12 months. And so we break all of that down on our website too. So if you're receiving early intervention and you're curious about developmental milestones, you can check that out. We have our Down syndrome guidelines for inclusive education resource, which is a great guidebook for you as you're navigating school, looking at the benefits of inclusion, different ways that you can propose that within your school and work with your school in collaboration. We have several checklists and best practices worksheets on there, a detailed graphic of the specific learning profile. Individuals with Down syndrome have a profile that is specific to their needs. Again, I want to reiterate, every person with Down syndrome is unique and an individual, but there is research that shows, they do have very strong working memories, but some weakness in verbal processing, right? So we know these things. So there is a detailed graphic of a learning profile that is also really helpful to share with anybody that's working with your child, whether it's in a school setting or in a therapy setting, that can just provide a quick snapshot overview of Down syndrome and how it looks in many individuals. And then as your child ages and gets older, we have written by our very own Charlotte Woodward, who is a young woman with Down syndrome. She has a self-advocate IEP tips worksheet as well that is helpful when you are involving your child in more as an active role in their IEP. So this was a lot of information, really high level, again, of the difference between an IFSP and an IEP. Your IFSP is for that birth to 3, maybe only 2.5, depending on when you're turning 3 and you would transition into the school. And then an IEP is something that you have from age 3 until 21. You're able to stay in school with an IEP until you're 21. You might graduate at 18 and still continue on with some transition related services, but really that's kind of the age band of what an IEP covers. So you will be dealing with IEPs for the better bulk of your child's school career, and that IFSP is really for early intervention, but by age 3, the IEP will kick in and take over. I will be joining live for questions on May 6th at 7 p.m., so tune in for that. And I just want to thank everybody for being here, showing up, and being a part of this community. And remember that you are your child's strongest advocate, and NDSS is here to help and support you every step of the way. And so if you have any education related questions and you missed the live Q&A, you can feel free to reach out to me or to our education inbox here. And I'm more than happy to get you in touch with the right people or share some of the resources that I mentioned with you. Thank you.